Hello everybody, welcome to today's video on AQA GCSE English Literature Paper 1. Now for GCSE English Language we've had 4 sittings of the exams, the summer 2017 and then the November resit and the same for 2018. And looking over 4 papers, 4 mark schemes, 4 examiners reports can really help us to familiarise ourselves with some of the more challenging aspects of those exams. For literature, we're in a different situation. There is no resit, so we've only had 2 sittings of the literature exams. But I think we can still pull a lot of interesting information out of the actual exam papers themselves, and I'll tell you why. You might be studying Macbeth, but of course there are questions on numerous Shakespeare plays, numerous 19th century novels. So I've looked at all of the questions we've seen across all of the texts, looking at how those questions are worded, and I want to go through that with you in this video. This is not an exhaustive list. This doesn't mean your question next week will look like one of these, but this will help you look at the sorts of things you can be revising in the last few days before the exam. So the first thing is questions that have a direct reference to a theme. And this is where a question is worded in such a way where it directly references what we know is a major theme of the text. So sticking with Macbeth, it would be something like, starting with this speech, explore how Shakespeare presents ambition in Macbeth. And straight away we know ambition is a major theme and we know what to write about. That's absolutely fantastic. But we've only seen that, in my opinion, 6 times across all of the questions, and that's a relatively low number, as you'll see. So 6 times we've seen questions directly referencing major themes such as ambition in Macbeth. Other texts could be justice, relationships between adults and young people, attitudes to love, Pride and Prejudice, and you can perhaps guess which text that was in. So that's, I think, the easiest type of question to answer, because you should be studying the writer's ideas and themes when you're studying a text. And I would just say at this point, I have videos on every single Shakespeare play, every 19th century novel. Check out my playlists if you're not confident with the writer's ideas and themes, or just for general revision, of course. Now the next kind of question is where we have an indirect reference to a theme, and we've seen this 5 times, where the question is worded in such a way where it does reference a topic or a theme, but it's not the main theme of the text. So this would be, if we stick with something like Macbeth, because I know this is the text that most of you are studying, starting with this moment in the play, explore how Shakespeare presents the attitudes of Macbeth and Banquo towards the supernatural. Now the supernatural, there's lots you can write about it in the exam, but I still don't think it is a major theme in the text. I don't think the ideas Shakespeare is making were really about the supernatural. I think he's using the supernatural to reference his wider themes and ideas. And this was actually pointed out in the examiner's report as well, that an effective approach to that question, for example, was to think about the contrasting ideas that Banquo and Macbeth have towards the supernatural, and then use that to link to the contrasting ideas in the themes of integrity, loyalty, power and ambition. So what I'm saying is you might have a question which says something and you think, wow, I don't know what that theme is, and you have to actually make the connection. Okay, if I'm writing about this, what's the wider theme that I can write about? If I'm writing about the supernatural in Macbeth, how can I link that to the key theme it's connected to, integrity or loyalty or power or ambition? So that indirect reference to a theme is so important. And what's interesting is this often scares students. They often look at this and think, I don't know what to write about. There was an example in Romeo and Juliet, which was explore how Shakespeare presents aggressive male behaviour. And students thought, oh, we haven't studied aggressive male behaviour. But no, it's linking that to the wider themes in the text. And just making that connection is so important. So 6 times we saw direct references to a key theme, 5 times what I would call indirect references, where you have to make the connection. What is the wider theme this question is linking to? Now 12 times we had a question which gave a direct reference to one character. And what's so interesting is every single time we saw this, it was how is the character presented as being something. So how is Portia presented as a strong female, Brutus as a conspirator, Antony as manipulative, Jekyll as worthy of sympathy, Miss Havisham as cruel and bitter, and on it goes. So yes, we should know the characters in our texts really well, but we should be aware that if the question's going to be on that character, there's a high chance that it will be how is the character presented as something. So it will really direct you in your answer. You're not just writing everything you know about a character, but how is the monster presented as evil, Elizabeth as strong-willed, Holmes as interesting and unusual, that kind of thing. A pointed, focused question on a key characteristic to do with a character. The good news is that every single time we've had a question like that, it hasn't been something that's out there to kind of shock you and think, what? I never thought about that. Portia as a strong female, and Brutus as a conspirator, the monster as a victim, Jane as a victim. You know, these are things that are key points to the text. They're not there to trick you. But it's good to revise your characters and think about not just the characters as a whole, but how would I answer a question if my character was presented in this way or presented in that way? On 9 occasions, we had direct references to more than one character, and this could be a pair of characters or a whole grouping of characters. So in some of the romance texts, we had questions which were the relationship between two people. So the relationship between Miranda and Ferdinand, the relationship between Beatrice and Benedict, the relationship between Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth. And those are characters that we would pair up a lot in our revision and should be quite familiar with. But there were some more tricky questions in these sorts of pairing questions, as we saw with the Macbeth question, attitudes of Macbeth and Banquo towards the supernatural, and those might not be two characters that we would always think of pairing up together. And then the question sometimes would be wider than a pair, it would be a group. So it could be, let's think, how Dickens uses the Cratchit family as a whole to show something. Or we saw in The Sign of Four how the police force are presented as ineffective and foolish. So be aware in your revision of the groupings that you can put together in your texts and think about how those are presented as a group. Once or twice the questions were particularly difficult. I think the Great Expectations question was very difficult. How Pip's attitudes to the convict Magwitch are presented. So the idea of one character's attitudes towards another character and how they are presented is something you might want to look at in your revision as well. A couple of times we saw a statement which you were asked to respond to, a little bit like AQA English Language Paper 1 Question 4. So it would say something like, Shakespeare presents Antony as a manipulative character who is skilled at getting what he wants. Starting with this extract, explore how far you agree with this opinion. And of course, those how far questions also came up a number of times, twice to respond to a question, but actually the wording of how far came up 8 times. And this comes to the close reading of the question. If you've got a how far prompt, that'll enable you to construct evaluative responses which demonstrate your appreciation of the text. Now, what can we learn from this? Well, what I want to say first off, and this is so important, is this is not the only things your questions might look like. Your questions next week will not definitely fall into one of these categories, but I do think this is helpful for helping you with your revision. What if a question came up as a direct reference to a theme? Would you be able to answer it? Which part of the text would you link to? Which characters would you write about? Which quotes would you use? What if there was an indirect reference? Would you be able to pause, stop and think, how can I use this indirect reference and link to the key theme that this is linked to, this is connected to? What about if there's a direct reference to a character? Could you analyse the characters if you're asked to analyse the way they're presented as strong, manipulative, worthy of sympathy, cruel, victims, evil, strong-willed, that kind of thing? I think possibly the hardest, what if you're asked to direct your answer to more than one character, a group in the text, or perhaps a pairing in the text, whether that's a couple or a pairing that you're perhaps not so likely to expect. The idea of Ariel as a loyal servant to Prospero came up in that section. Be aware you might be asked to respond to a statement, and you might have a how far question, so you can evaluate and look at both sides of the argument. You might also have something totally different. This is not an exhaustive list, but I do think it's useful to think about the fact that these are the kinds of wordings of questions that we've had so far, and this is a good way to direct this last few days of your revision. Which of these kinds of questions would really stump you? Which would you really struggle with? And how can you make sure you avoid that struggle? If you found this video useful, please do subscribe to the channel.